Hi guys. Here I come again to tell you what I found about Ekko and Jinx having talked to each other during the time lapse between Act 1 and Act 2 of Arcane. Lots of people wondered whether Ekko and Jinx saw each other after Powder was taken in by Silco. And even though we know now that they at least knew about each other, since Arcane script author Amanda confirmed that Jinx knew about Ekko being the Firelight's leader, and Ekko knew she worked for Silco. I have also found some proofs of the talks they had during that time. Which proves that yes, Ekko did try to bring her back to her senses, but Powder was the one to send him away. In the Concil's Archives short stories, a kind of detective story game that was launched onto League of Legends before Arcane's release, in Jinx's part, we can actually read entries from her diary after she was taken in by Silco. In her diary, she's letting on about her guilt and how she feels towards Vi abandoning her, but we can also see her mind deteriorate as she grows up and starts hearing the voices of the people she killed. On the main page of the Concil's Archives, which stories were centered on Vi, Caitlyn, Jinx, and Jace only, we can see all the people that are mentioned or present in the stories. We can see Ekko among them. But actually, Ekko was mentioned nowhere. He was only implied here, in Jinx's diary, in that conversation I'm talking about. What particularly caught my attention is something I realized only a few days after having read the diary for the first time. The way Jinx entries looked on page 2 and 3 are completely different than the ones on page 1. The entries of page 2 and 3 are perfectly pointed out, like they are listed, but when you compare it to the first page, you can see there that her entries have quotation marks, like she is quoting something someone said. These entries have quotation marks because what we're reading on this page is not Jinx's thoughts. It is her quoting a conversation. The way Jinx wrote the voices she hears is different in the next pages. There is a moment where she writes, "I'll always be with you, Powder," like Vi was the one telling her this. But as she wrote that, she hasn't put quotation marks. She only did it on that first page. And that conversation we're reading is actually the one she had with Ekko. Let's look at it for a minute. The talk is actually divided into 3 entries, which implies that there were 3 different talks between them. Also, the entries are linked to the drawings in Jinx's diary, which is the only page where she has drawn Ekko too. Ekko tells her they were just kids, and Jinx answers saying a sister wouldn't abandon her, to which Ekko answers family forgives. Powder then says they were never a family, and Ekko tells her it's all his fault. Let's think about it for a minute. This is not a talk she could have had with Silco. Silco would never be the one to tell her that Vi would forgive her, or tell her that Vi would never abandon her. He wouldn't have been the one to tell her family forgives.
Your sister's gone. You know that as well as I do.
I know.
It can't possibly be a talk she had with Sevika either, since there's no way either of them would have answered it's their fault to Powder telling them, "We were never a family."
You were for your family, Jinx.
So this is definitively not a conversation she had with Silco or Sevika. Now, let's imagine those were the voices in her head talking to her. We know that's not how her PTSD breakdowns and traumatic anxiety works. Clagger and Milo's voices are not the comforting type. They are the type to blame her for everything and tell her that she is a Jinx. They wouldn't be the ones to tell her she'd be forgiven for what she'd done, nor tell her that Vi wouldn't abandon her, when the next pages clearly shows that's what the voices are telling her and how Jinx feels. No. The one telling her those words is the only other person Jinx can talk to, and that is alive, and knew her as a kid, and that can only be Ekko. Also, let me add that the part "it's all my fault" is there to put the reader on the wrong path and make us think Jinx is the one to think that it's her fault, just like she writes it later. But that actually makes sense that Ekko would say this, or at least think this way.
That's a good way to drive yourself crazy.
Remember what Ekko says to Vi in the Firelight's
If I
hideout.
just went with you that day, maybe none of this would have happened.
Of course Ekko wouldn't have made a difference in the fight, since he was just a child, but what he meant by that was that he could have stopped Powder and could have prevented the explosion from happening. He feels responsible for her mistake. He probably also feels responsible for the whole incident, since he's the one to have followed Silco and to have told Vi, and therefore Powder too, where they took Vander.
Ekko followed them. The old cannery next to the docks. He said,
Ekko doesn't think Powder is a Jinx and doesn't want her to take the blame for what happened because he feels responsible for it too. After that, Jinx makes 2 other entries, separated by an entry in which she is forsaking Powder by striking it down. Both entries say, "I'm sorry," with quote marks once again, like she is saying it to someone. Perhaps she is saying it to the voices in her head, to her lost ones, but I think she might have said it to Ekko, as this was her way of saying goodbye. Not to mention that is the exact name of the song that is linked to Powder's thoughts at the end of Act 1. Between those two I'm sorry, she has decided to forsake Powder. If she had been talking to her lost ones, if she had been talking to the dead, feeling sorry for what she'd done, she wouldn't have struck her own name like she did. It won't make sense that she's apologizing for what she did and forsaking herself in the meantime, because her apologizing to them would have mean she's still Powder feeling sorry for what she did, when clearly, what she showed by striking her own name is that she didn't feel like she was Powder anymore. She forsake Powder in the past by forsaking Ekko and letting go, and she apologized for it. Now, this has nothing to do with Ekko, but a lot of people didn't realize Jinx was actually hearing Vi's voice too in her PTSD breakdowns. Not in the way that is shown in Arcane. What I mean by that is that the same way she saw and heard Milo and Clagger, she actually saw and heard Vi too. Because she thought Vi was dead too, since that was what Marcus told Silco, and what Silco told her. Vi was entirely part of her PTSD and inner demons too, just like Milo and Clagger. See what she wrote in her diary on page 2. Sisters say I'm no good enough. She doesn't say it, but she thinks it. I can see it when she looks at me. Stop looking at me. I first thought Powder could have written that when she was a child and everyone was still around, but it doesn't match with the entries on the first page, nor the drawings attached to this page that shows her grown-up self as Jinx, shows her guns, and the scene of episode 3 where Vi abandoned her and Silco and his goons were surrounding her in that fire. In the next entries, she talks about how Vi abandoned her and everything she feels about that, and while she's letting on about her guilt and conflicted mind, we can see the grudge she holds against Vi, while between the entries she writes words that seem to be said by Vi herself, but that aren't quoted like before with her talk with Ekko. That is because these words come from Jinx's mind, it is not a real conversation she had with Vi. She is hearing those words in her head, the same way she hears Milo and Clagger. That is why, when she reunites with Vi in episode 6, she asks her if she is real.
Are you real?
Jinx is so used to seeing dead bodies and hearing their voices in her head that she just can't believe Vi is really there. And for a moment, she stares at her doubtfully, before she breaks apart and starts crying, when she understands it's really her. Skipping parts, we can clearly see Jinx's mind start deteriorating through time. While she goes on about her and Silco being perfect for each other, because they're both broken, she knows he's taking care of her, and she trusts him, but as she kills more and more people, it seems like she's consolating herself by thinking there is an afterlife, and that it is somehow someplace great and peaceful. She doesn't understand why people she kills look sad, and she thinks they shouldn't be, since they'll be together in the afterlife. That shows how Jinx thinks about death, but also shows us why she has such an unhealthy fear of death, like Arcane script author said in one of her tweets. She is not afraid of death because she thinks there is some place better afterwards. In psychology, that simply means she thinks living is the bad place. Living is being hell for her, and way worse than being dead. In her entries, she says that she closes the dead's eyes, but that she can still see them. Even though Arcane only showed us Clagger and Milo in her PTSD breakdowns, Jinx seems apparently haunted by more than one dead body. She says that everyone she took care of, probably meaning everyone she killed, are here in her mind. And she says that among them is Vi too. Throughout the pages, we can see her entries and drawings demonizing Vi, as her memories were deteriorated with time and trauma, and we can see that the evil mouth she has drawn for Vi on the last drawing is actually the same angry mouth she has drawn on her workshop, where we can clearly see an angry mouth grinding its teeth on the wall. I thought it was a mere drawing at first, but after seeing how Jinx represented Vi in her diary, I realized it looked pretty similar to how she seemed to have pictured Vi throughout the years. That diary is really showing us an important part of how Jinx's mind works, and explains a lot about how she reacted after reuniting with Vi in Act 2. Jinx thought Vi was dead all this time, and to be able to bear with the guilt and grief, she has forced herself to think Vi lied to her all her life, and was an evil person. But then she learns Vi is alive, and she then came across the realization that if she indeed wasn't dead, that meant she really abandoned her, since she never came back for her. In Jinx's mind, she feels that if Vi is really alive, then it means she really abandoned her, and is really a liar, because she never came back for her. She went to lit up the flare to make sure of that. She lit it as a test for Vi, because she needed to see if she would keep her word, or if she was that liar Jinx had forced herself to think she was, to shield herself from her traumatic memories. As Vi proved her wrong by coming back for her, it was years of false self-perception and self-persuasion, On top of the guilt that suddenly resurfaced thinking of all the people she killed, that Jinx had to face in front of her. She's been lying to herself all those years, having her reality twisted, and now she's facing the exact opposite of what she's been telling herself for a decade, and she has to deal with it. Jinx still needed explanations, and wanted to understand why Vi didn't come back for her sooner, but even though she trusted Vi and believed in her words, her mind was too much twisted by Milo's poisonous words, and the fact Silco and everyone was lying to her, and she didn't know who to believe anymore, or how she should deal with all those chaotic feelings. Well anyway, we all know how that turned out. It is really heartbreaking to see how Jinx's mind deteriorated throughout the time lapse, and how twisted her reality was, but this diary also brought a lot of answers to the shadow areas that were left between Act 2 and 3, and I really hope we somehow get a glimpse of all those moments in Season 2 flashbacks. I don't think Silco really awakened anything in her, like he taught her things or filled her mind with his own thoughts. All he did was unlock what was already inside her. Same goes for Jinx's wrath and rage, but I will show that in another video, when I will talk about the true beginning of Jinx's traumas, and how it all really started for Powder. Anyway, I hope you liked this video. It was just some things I realized and wanted to share with you guys. Please let me know what you thought of it in the comments. I will soon come up with more analysis and things I discovered, and that haven't been talked about on the internet yet. So you can subscribe to the channel, if you're curious and don't want to miss it. See you soon, and thanks for watching.